Hi, it's Tom taking a look at Monster Hunter Double Cross on Nintendo Switch. Also known as Generations in the West, a demo has been released on the Switch Japanese eShop ahead of its release there in August. And so, given the Switch is entirely region-free, I thought I'd put it to the test against the 3DS original, comparing both visuals and frame rate. What we have to work with is pretty substantial too, 3 missions and 15 preset characters. From what I've gathered, there's sadly no access to the hub area, but even with the first mission, you can easily see how Capcom is using Switch's more powerful GPU to upgrade its visuals over 3DS. Not that you'd expect much less. After all, the 3DS version runs at a 400 by 240 resolution on the top screen at 30 FPS with frame pacing issues. The frame pacing is a nuisance, but still, Monster Hunter Double Cross remains one of the most technically demanding games on the handheld. Enter this Switch demo and it's clear this isn't just the 3DS version running at a higher resolution. Instead, most aspects of the game get a respectable reworking for Nintendo's newer machine. Let's start with the resolution first. Going from 240p on the 3DS, the Switch gets pushed right up to a full native 1080p while docked under a TV. There's even a passive anti-aliasing, what I understand is a post-process technique, running over the top, all of which makes it a significant upgrade over the 3DS in image quality, which I've upscaled here for the sake of comparison. Now obviously, viewed on 3DS's smaller screen, it looks much better with a perfect pixel match for that display. It's always a slightly unbalanced test in this regard, but it does demonstrate that Switch opens the gates to a beautiful home console version, pushing the game to 1920 by 1080 with a lot more besides. For Switch in portable mode meanwhile, that resolution is reined in. Just like Mario Kart 8 Deluxe, it drops to a native 720p when playing out and about, which again still looks razor sharp on the smaller display. One important thing to note here is visual settings are otherwise identical between docked and portable. There's a host of graphical upgrades on Switch versus 3DS which I'll cover now, but the good news is every one of them is maintained regardless of how you play, and it's only that resolution that really changes. Okay, with that in mind, let's see what Switch brings to the table in docked mode. Bearing in mind, a bump to 1920 by 1080 meant Capcom couldn't rest on its laurels with the original 3DS textures and effects. Capcom absolutely had to push the boat out in every other respect. And that's precisely what we're getting here, with textures being very obviously overhauled. Across the board, texture maps are replaced with crisper, higher grade versions, and shadow quality is bumped up too, giving Switch's 1080p output something to show off. There's no sign of any ambitious parallax or bump mapping here, that might be expecting too much, and what you end up with here are often very flat, rigid surfaces. Even so, the resolution of each asset is marked up significantly, and that applies to water and ice shaders across the game too. A really welcome touch over and above that is the inclusion of high-grade anisotropic filtering. I'd put this at 8 or 16 times going by eye, just given how clear and sharp textures are running into the distance. There's no sign of a filtering cascade, in other words, a small drawback we see on so many first-party Nintendo titles. Here, Capcom's made a clear point of upgrading from the rougher bilinear filtering we had on 3DS, and again, it's a choice that works beautifully on the big screen. Now, as you'd expect, draw distances on grass and objects are also ramped up on Switch. In fact, the density of grass is higher in general, as you can see here. To its credit, 3DS typically rendered polygonal elements like monsters far into the distance without too many cutbacks, but certainly decorative parts of the world had a fairly harsh cutoff in rendering range, causing pop-in on 3DS. That's for the most part eliminated on Switch. Just about everything is rendered across each area as it's loaded, from the monsters to the huge backdrops, creating a consistent look to the world. A surprise upgrade on Switch comes via some new post-effects. Bloom and pre-baked light shafts were already in the 3DS version, but this time Capcom can take things even further with fully dynamic light shafts. Also known as crepuscular rays, these react whenever the environment obscures light, giving a sense of density to the air. It's a beautiful touch on Switch, and if we go back to 3DS, it's clearly missing. All we have are the baked-in pre-drawn god rays to the side, but nothing around the character. This is brand new to Switch and again marks a very visible step away from the technical limits on 3DS. Visually speaking then, Capcom isn't going in half-hearted with Monster Hunter on Switch. You get upgraded textures, high-resolution shadows, broadened draw distances, new lighting effects and more, all presented at 1080p. The only criticism here is geometry, where the characters, monsters and map layout appear to conform to the basic angular design used on 3DS. Parts of the world are updated, and Switch's new texturing helps hide the similarities, but the fact is the framework of the world has some roots in the older handheld version, and it can show. Regardless, it's still a great looking conversion. All of which leads us on to Monster Hunter's performance. To cut to the chase, Switch runs at a straight 30 FPS based on this demo, just like the 3DS version before it. What you're seeing here is the machine docked, running at 1080p and taking on the major bosses for all 3 missions, where there's not even a hint of a drop. Obviously there is an issue though, and frame pacing is again a problem on Switch, just like the 3DS playback. For reference, this is how the 3DS and new 3DS versions of Monster Hunter Generations performed side by side. Visually, there were no differences between the two, but frustratingly, they both forced a 30 FPS cap with frame pacing stutters. It's not ideal, and that trend unfortunately passes on to Switch. In truth, I'd hoped for a full 60 FPS, especially given the new 3DS played games like Monster Hunter 4 Ultimate at around the 50 FPS mark, thanks to it running unlocked. That being said, there's really no telling how near or far Switch is from a full 60 FPS. The performance headroom is completely hidden, and we have to appreciate the fact it brings a host of visual upgrades over the 3DS too. Another big positive is that Switch in handheld mode is also very strong here. Again, it's 30 FPS, but playing the demo from start to finish, I've yet to catch a single drop. Fixing the game's pixel output to 720p helps match the lower GPU clock profile while playing portable, just like most games on Switch, and the result for Monster Hunter is rock solid performance across the demo. A quick word on loading times. There's no perfect match for the 3DS original in terms of leaving the hub area, but at least we can see moving between areas takes a similar time frame on Switch. In testing the two closely, Switch actually takes around a second longer than 3DS before bringing us back to gameplay, likely a byproduct of loading in more high quality textures. That's measured from the Switch's internal storage, but overall the margins are very small, and it's a reasonable price to pay for the upgrades we're getting elsewhere. Monster Hunter Double Cross isn't far off its Japanese launch, and hopefully we'll have more details on a Western release soon. Either way, it's shaping up nicely in its Switch incarnation. You get a raft of new visual details and a stable, if unambitious, 30 FPS cap for both docked and portable modes. It's a marked improvement over 3DS obviously too, a game that ranked as one of the most demanding on the hardware, all of which pins the final release on Switch as potentially the best way to experience the series when it arrives. Anyway, that's all from me. If you did find this interesting or insightful in any way, do let me know with a like or subscribe. And as ever, you can find the source file to this video at our Patreon at digitalfoundry.net. But until next time, thanks for watching.